In 2008, NASA faced a problem that had nothing to do with building another rocket. The Space Shuttle program was approaching retirement, but the International Space Station still needed regular deliveries. NASA needed a reliable way to transport cargo to orbit. For decades, the agency had depended on major aerospace companies to build its spacecraft and launch systems. But this time, NASA was considering a different approach. Instead of building everything itself, what if NASA simply became the customer? Private companies would develop the vehicles, NASA would pay for missions, and competition would determine which systems survived. It sounded efficient. But there was one major question. Which private company could NASA actually trust? One of the companies asking for that chance was SpaceX. At the time, it was still a young company with a limited flight record and plenty to prove. NASA's decision would eventually help reshape the commercial space industry. NASA's new approach wasn't simply about finding a cheaper rocket, it was about changing how America developed its next generation of space transportation. Under the traditional model, NASA would define the requirements, fund development, and manage much of the process. The commercial model was different. NASA could purchase transportation as a service. Private companies would develop their own systems and take on more of the responsibility for making them work. And there was another important possibility. A spacecraft developed for NASA could also serve commercial customers. That meant the government would not necessarily be the only source of revenue. Companies could build a business around the same technology. NASA wasn't just looking for another contractor. It was testing whether a private market for space transportation could actually work. On paper, SpaceX was not the obvious choice. Established aerospace companies already had decades of experience, massive facilities, experienced engineers, and long histories of government contracts. SpaceX had none of that legacy. It was a young company trying to prove that it could build and launch rockets reliably, and the timing was unforgiving. In 2008, SpaceX had already experienced 3 Falcon 1 launch failures. Only the 4th attempt would finally reach orbit. So when NASA considered giving SpaceX a major role in resupplying the International Space Station, the agency wasn't choosing between 2 equally proven systems. It was taking a chance on a company that had only just demonstrated that it could reach orbit. That was the real risk. NASA had to believe that SpaceX could go from a young startup with a fragile track record to a dependable transportation provider. And in 2008, nobody knew whether that bet would work. In December 2008, NASA announced the winners of its Commercial Resupply Services program. SpaceX was selected alongside Orbital Sciences, with NASA awarding SpaceX a contract valued at about $1.6 billion for a series of cargo missions to the International Space Station. The money mattered, but the credibility mattered even more. NASA was effectively saying that SpaceX had earned the opportunity to prove itself on one of the biggest stages in spaceflight. The contract also gave SpaceX something every young company needs: a real customer with real missions and real deadlines. SpaceX now had to develop Dragon, prepare Falcon 9, and deliver cargo to the International Space Station. NASA, meanwhile, had a chance to test whether commercial companies could become a reliable part of America's space infrastructure. The contract was not a guarantee of success. It was a bet that success was possible. Winning the contract was only the beginning. SpaceX still had to deliver. Dragon had to be developed. Falcon 9 had to work. The spacecraft had to reach orbit, approach the International Space Station, safely deliver its cargo, and eventually return to Earth. In December 2010, Dragon completed a successful orbital test mission, becoming the first privately developed spacecraft to be recovered successfully from orbit. But the real test came 2 years later. In 2012, Dragon became the first commercial spacecraft to deliver cargo to the International Space Station and return safely to Earth. That was the moment the relationship between NASA and SpaceX changed. SpaceX was no longer simply a young company promising that it could build something. It had demonstrated an operational transportation system. NASA had taken a risk, and SpaceX had started proving that the risk could pay off. The consequences went far beyond NASA. Once SpaceX had a working rocket and spacecraft, it could pursue customers outside the government, communication satellites, scientific missions, Earth observation payloads, commercial launches, government missions, NASA contracts. The same launch infrastructure could serve all of them. And that created an important advantage. More customers could mean more launches. More launches meant more operational experience. More experience created opportunities to improve the system and reduce costs. SpaceX was no longer building isolated missions one at a time. It was building a launch business designed to operate repeatedly. NASA had provided the initial opportunity, but the commercial market could help sustain the company. That combination would become one of SpaceX's most important advantages. But NASA needed more than cargo. After the Space Shuttle retired in 2011, the United States also needed a new way to send astronauts to the International Space Station. That led to another competition, and this time the stakes were even higher. SpaceX wasn't being asked to deliver supplies. It was being asked to carry people. Crew Dragon had to meet far more demanding safety requirements, including life support, emergency escape, and systems designed around human passengers. A cargo mission could lose equipment. A crewed mission could put astronauts' lives at risk. SpaceX had to prove that its technology could operate at an entirely different level. In May 2020, Crew Dragon carried NASA astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken to the International Space Station. It was the first crewed orbital launch from American soil since the Space Shuttle era. The experiment that NASA had started years earlier had become a functioning transportation system. This is what makes NASA's original decision so important. NASA had not simply selected SpaceX to deliver cargo. It had helped establish a different model for government and commercial spaceflight. Instead of NASA owning and operating every transportation system itself, private companies could develop vehicles and sell transportation services to the government. NASA could become a customer rather than the owner of the entire system. That gave companies an incentive to build technology that could serve both government and commercial markets. And it allowed NASA to focus more of its resources on missions beyond routine transportation. The model extended far beyond SpaceX. NASA was helping create an environment where private companies could become part of the infrastructure of American spaceflight. But NASA's decision alone did not create the SpaceX we know today. SpaceX still had to turn the opportunity into something much bigger. Falcon 9 became a major commercial launch vehicle. Its boosters began returning to Earth and flying again. Launch frequency increased. Starlink eventually became one of the company's largest internal customers, creating even more demand for launches. And Starship pushed SpaceX toward an even more ambitious future. None of that was guaranteed in 2008. NASA could not know that SpaceX would eventually operate a huge launch business, develop reusable rockets at scale, build a global satellite network, or attempt to create a fully reusable heavy-lift spacecraft. NASA could only decide whether the company deserved an opportunity, and that distinction matters. NASA didn't choose the SpaceX we know today. NASA chose the possibility that SpaceX could become it. The most important part of this story isn't the $1.6 billion contract. It's what happened after NASA took the risk. SpaceX had to prove itself. It developed Dragon. It delivered cargo. It carried astronauts. Falcon 9 became a commercial launch platform. Reusable boosters changed the economics and rhythm of launch operations, and the relationship between NASA and private space companies changed with it. NASA's decision did not guarantee any of this. It simply created an opening. SpaceX had to turn that opening into a functioning business and a new way of operating in space. That may be the most important lesson of the entire story. In 2008, NASA wasn't choosing between the SpaceX of today and the aerospace companies of yesterday. It was choosing whether to give a young private company a chance to compete. NASA said yes. SpaceX then had to prove that the chance was worth taking, and that combination, NASA taking the initial risk and SpaceX turning that opportunity into something much larger, helped create a new era of commercial spaceflight. Today, NASA routinely works with private companies to transport cargo, astronauts, and technology into orbit. The bigger question is what comes next. How much of the future of spaceflight will be built by companies that governments once had to take a chance on? And when history looks back at SpaceX, will NASA's decision in 2008 be remembered as the moment that changed everything, or simply the moment that gave SpaceX the opportunity to change it? Let me know what you think in the comments.